Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Ocean's Light, Book of the Pirate, Book 1 by Mina, Chara, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Big Red X. Blueport was small, the streets narrow, and paved with wonky cobbled stone. The buildings curved inward the higher they rose, and the sky was often overcast. The cartographer's shop was a frequent stop for Evie Waters, a lover of all things related to maps and a collector of curious artifacts. "I can make all the necessary astronomical calculations," Evie said from below as Monsieur Durand slipped down from the book ladder, several tomes in hand. "I can perform calculations myself, Mademoiselle Waters," he grumbled, setting a pair of thick books on his desk. The dark circles under his eyes looked deeper under the candlelight. "Ah, but am I not the only person in town with a near-perfect memory? Did I not copy one of your maps perfectly, monsieur, after only seeing it once?" She smiled as he sighed, moving around her. "I do believe I would be a great asset to the Royal Navy with my miraculous memory," she insisted. Durand refused to look up from the book he was studying, but Evie hardly noticed. She was searching the maps that lined the shop's walls, looking for inspiration. "I know the names of every country, town, and city on these maps, monsieur. Can others say the same?" "That map over there," she said, pointing to the far wall. "I've glanced at it only once, and I know every city and country on the parchment," she said, smiling in triumph. Monsieur Durand narrowed his eyes and lifted a tome large enough to cover the map completely. "The capital?" he asked in a haughty tone. "Flores, monsieur," Evie replied. "The town furthest from the capital." "Colina Verde." "The largest port?" "Ancla." "Aha!" exclaimed Monsieur Durand, pointing an accusatory finger. "Wrong, mademoiselle. It is the Puerto de Flores." Durand beamed and dropped his book, uncovering the map. Evie looked up and frowned. Puerto de Flores and Ancla looked much the same size on the map, but clearly one was larger in person. "I do not wish to hire you, Mademoiselle Waters," said Monsieur Durand. "Well, then, perhaps I could check your calculations?" Evie reached for the map, and Monsieur Durand's hands came crashing down on the wooden desk. She jumped back, startled, and Monsieur Durand looked up, his wig askew. "Mademoiselle Waters," he began in an irritated tone, "it is quite unladylike to go around taking your anger out on inanimate objects." He reached up to straighten his white wig and then his shirt, heavily embroidered with flowers over a rotten yellow shade. "Monsieur, I need this job. Desperately," Evie implored. Monsieur Durand pursed his lips and turned away, picking up a pile of books. "What sort of education did you have?" he asked. "You know I have no formal education," Evie groaned. She still wore the apron from her job at a local inn. "Then why would I hire you?" he asked with a chuckle. "Because, despite my lack of formal education, I can still do everything required better than most," Evie stressed, the pitch of her voice beginning to heighten. Durand looked over his shoulder with a sneer. "I apologize, monsieur. I did not mean to raise my voice." "Shall I add quick to anger to the list of reasons to decline your services, mademoiselle?" said Durand, climbing the ladder once again. Evie sighed as her eyes fell on the stand for an old telescope and darted from map to map. Her jaw clenched and her eyes fell on the floor. "I'm afraid I can't make an opening for you, mademoiselle," Durand repeated. Evie's shoulders slumped. "Monsieur," she began, but Durand turned from the old wooden ladder to snap at her once more. "It is not that you are not talented, Mademoiselle Waters. It is simply that I do not have the time to teach," he said as he slammed down the pile he had just picked up. Evie's face began to fall as soon as she saw the resolve in Monsieur Durand's eyes. "Monsieur, you have known me since I was a small girl." 5 or 19, it makes no difference." With that, he waved his hand toward the door, picked up his books, and returned to his shelves. Evie took a deep, shaking breath. The paper in her hands crumpled and ruined as she ran from Monsieur Durand's front door and slammed it closed behind her. In the quiet alleyway behind Monsieur Durand's shop, Evie slid to her knees and wailed. But she allowed herself only a moment or two of despair before wiping the tears away. She took in a long breath, stood up, and set off. Her footsteps pressed onto the cobbled stone with a precise click. wobbling only when her anger forced her to walk too fast. Barely 19, Evie Waters had golden brown skin that was darker under her eyes. Her hair was nearly black, her brown eyes were round, and her nose turned down slightly at the end. Her lips were sharp, and most notably she wore large round glasses. She moved quickly through groups of women who chatted while trying not to block the walkways, through crowds of young boys up to no good, through the children playing with sticks, and past the large, loud blacksmiths and farmers who slammed their ale together at the end of the day. She passed the boy lighting all the gas lamps for the night and the women with the fiddle who'd made good coin on that day, and turned into a narrow alleyway to look at the church that sat on the top of the island at Blueport's Peak. The sky darkened, beginning to fill with storm clouds as Evie walked up the stone steps and ducked into a narrow alley. She pulled up her hood and kept low below the height of the windows. The wind howled. Evie could hear the roar of the sea, though she was as far as she could be from the coast. Looking out over the green grassy fields, she could see the flora swaying and hissing in the gale. Evie found the window she was looking for and pulled the frame up carefully and slowly, taking a deep breath as she did so. She pulled her skirts over the edge of the window sill like she was riding a horse, and then turned back to the outside for one more look at the waves before pulling her other leg in. Evie swallowed hard as her foot reached the hard wooden floor, rough and water-stained. She held her breath and pulled. Wood slid silently against wood until the window closed and Evie smiled. "Did you have fun?" "Ah!" Evie spun, her face flushed with embarrassment. An old woman, her hair pulled back hard and tight, arms crossed, and dressed in bright red robes, stood in the passageway. Evie's face fell, and she swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Mademoiselle Lily," she whispered. Mademoiselle Lily's eyes narrowed. "It's dangerous, you know that." "I do." Lily stepped closer and, taking the younger girl by the chin, tilted Evie's head. "I do not wish to see you hurt, that's all." Evie pulled herself from the woman's grip, and Lily's hand stood motionless where Evie left it. "Did you get the job?" Lily asked, dropping her hand in frustration. "You know I didn't," said Evie with a sigh, pulling her bag off her shoulder. Mademoiselle Lily nodded as she turned to the rest of Evie's room. Outside, the wind was rising, and the rain fell in heavy sheets. The older woman's hand ran over the sketches and drawings Evie had nailed to the cold stone walls. Most of them were maps filled with excruciating detail, drawings of places Evie had never been, and sketches of wonders she'd imagined out of boredom. "I can't get your job at the inn back," Lily mused as she picked one of Evie's sketches up by the edge. "I know. I shouldn't have quit. Evie grumbled, pulling off her apron and thrusting it to the ground. "You wanted all or nothing," Lily added in a softer tone. "You've always been a bit of a gambler." Mademoiselle Lily smiled to herself as Evie retreated and nodded solemnly. She lifted the edge of one of Evie's sketches and smiled. "This one was always my favorite." "I drew that one years ago," said Evie with a sigh as she took off her shoes and climbed onto her bed. "Where's Anna?" she asked as she looked over to the empty bed on the other side of the room. "Being measured for her robes," said Mademoiselle Lily, letting go of the picture and putting her hands behind her back. Evie held back a sigh. "I could find a place for you in initiation this year," Mademoiselle Lily added with a cough. "The deadline for applications has already passed," Evie replied. "I would make an exception for you," the older woman insisted, "if that was what you wanted." Evie looked up and nodded. Her eyes turned to the window where the sounds of the ocean and the whistling of the wind were muffled by the glass. The clash of the waves on the rocky shore was static and distant, but rain pattered against the grubby glass. "I know what I want," Evie replied. The bed compressed beneath Mademoiselle Lily's weight. "I know, child," she said, taking Evie's hand in hers. "But how often have you played for everything and won?" "Not once," Evie smiled sadly. "Not everyone who gambles wins." Mademoiselle Lily let go of Evie's hand and got to her feet. "Think about it, child." "I will, mademoiselle. Seriously, I will," Evie replied, once more glancing out the window. "Let me know by the end of the week, and I will fast-track your application." "Thank you," said Evie with a nod, and seeming satisfied, Mademoiselle Lily turned on her heel to leave. The moment the heavy wooden doors closed and the iron latch clattered into place, Evie fell to the floor. She reached under her bed and pulled out an old wooden box containing a thick blue book. The spine was cracked and weathered, the front covered with fake gold and jewels. The pages were crusted and hard. Near the front of the book, a thick piece of parchment was jammed between the pages. Evie pulled it free and set the book down open on the floor. Her fingers traced the lines she knew all too well of islands far away. Names she knew only from ink and quill. Her eyes were fixed on the big red X. "Why would you leave this with me if you didn't want me to follow it?" she wondered, leaning back, her one arm behind her head. "Thing is, I know I should stay. I know it's what everyone wants." Evie turned her head to the wall she'd covered with graphite and caulk. I kept thinking something will happen, but I need to know why you left it with me. But maybe you didn't mean to?" she sighed, reaching her hand up to the light. "Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I was too." The warm light above her streamed through her fingertips. "Why am I unhappy?" She turned back to the book. "That's why I have to go all in. It's the only way I can convince myself things will change." She smiled at the painted paper jewel on the front of the book, sat up, her arms on the tips of her knees. "And that, Mum, Dad," she said, waving at empty space, "is why I can't stay." Nodding to herself, Evie got to her feet, eyes focused on the waves thrashing outside her window. Dark, like ink from a pot. All or nothing, she told herself. All or nothing.